Hey there, writing buddies. Michael here with another video for Mr. Swain. In today's video, I'm going to go over flashbacks and why I typically hate them. The flashback is typically used in order to get us some sort of crucial information that we need in order to continue the story. But because it might be kind of boring to just say it out loud, or maybe some characters don't know about it, so it's like they can't even say it because they don't know, they've forgotten, not going to come up in the dialogue naturally, whatever the case may be, we can't say it in the current story, so we have to do a flashback and go back in time and get Marty's parents together or something. Flashbacks give a writer a way to show, rather than tell, that information in a more engaging way. But God, I hate these. The main reason I hate flashbacks so much is that because they interfere and they slow down the pace of the current story. However, flashbacks can be done well. I'm going to go over a few different ways, a few different tips that you can do flashbacks so that way they are less intrusive to the story. And I'm going to order these kind of in the way that I like to be presented with a flashback. And you'll see why I gave quotes here in a second. If there's something that happens in your story that is a few years ago, or maybe 100 years ago, whatever, it doesn't really matter, but it happens in the past before your story starts, a good way to get that information out might just be the prologue or chapter 1. This is kind of why I gave quotes on flashback, because this right here is not technically a flashback because we haven't actually gotten to the current time yet. And that's kind of why it is my favorite form of a flashback, is because it's technically still linear, so I'm not getting into the story and then being shot back in time to have to deal with that. I'm just getting it, and then I just already know it, and I'll know it for the rest of the book. One example of this that most people have read is going to be Harry Potter. The first chapter shows Dumbledore leave Harry on the Dursleys' doorstep because he doesn't want to raise a kid, and then chapter 2 is like 10 years forward, and we start with Harry, and like that's where the real story kind of kicks off. I wonder how many people picked up Harry Potter and only read like the first page just to give it a shot, and then they thought it was about this guy named Vernon Dursley. Then and Now is not a style that I really enjoy reading a whole lot, to be honest, but I think I still like it better than actual flashback. This is where the author is basically giving two parallel stories in two different times that sync up together. So, and you typically will get like one chapter then, one chapter now, one chapter then, one chapter now. Most of these types of books you're going to read are going to be when the main character was a child and then when the main character is now an adult. But you're usually going to be getting like a 10, 15, maybe even 20-year gap. It's typically that. Again, this is not a typical flashback per se because we are getting the reader used to the back and forth. We're getting them used to it to where they expect it. They finish a chapter then, they know that the next chapter is going to be a now chapter, and when they get to the end of that chapter, no matter how cliffhangery it is, they know that they're going to go into a then chapter. They're mentally prepared for that. They know that they're going to have to read a past time in order to get back to the current time to deal with the fallout of whatever that cliffhanger might have been. Because of this rhythm that's established, I am more okay with this type of storytelling where we're going back and forth in time. The bonus to this is that we do get like two stories. Who doesn't like a buy one get one, right? The time hopping eventually ends, and it's usually on a really cool cliffhanger or a plot twist that, like, you know, changes the whole landscape of the now timeline. But then that time, the then timeline is done and we don't have to ever go back to it. So now, however many chapters are remaining, whether it be 1 or 10, whatever it is, we are now stuck in the main storyline, the now timeline, and we don't have to do this back and forth, this jump anymore. We know that we can just read the rest of the book as one thing. The negative to this, though, is if the then timeline is not as good as the now timeline, or vice versa. Basically, if either one of the timelines is not pulling their weight, then you will want to, as a reader, you will want to basically almost skip the then or nows, so whichever timeline's not good, and you'll want to just really just read the chapters of the storyline that is actually good and worth reading. This can often be a dilemma where people really aren't going to do that. They're not going to actually skip those chapters that they don't want to read. Instead, they're going to suffer and read those chapters because they don't want to miss any of the details. They want to, especially if it's the then timeline that sucks, they feel like they are going to have to read those because they're going to somehow play a part in the now timeline that's good. And if they don't know, then they're going to end up hurting the now timeline. It's a balancing act. It's a tough one, but it is doable. If you're finding this video helpful, go ahead and hit that like button down below. It'll help other writing buddies find this. and I really appreciate that. Thank you. Now we are getting into true flashback territory. I put visions as kind of like the first true flashback in my spiral of madness because these typically don't reoccur. It's usually a vision, a memory, or something like that that happens, and we get sent back in time. But when we come back, it's very unlikely that we're going to be doing that again. We got it's usually a one-off flashback time jump thing, and we don't really have to worry about it happening over and over again. I have very few redeeming things to say from this point forward, but this is my last one. If the character is doing something like mundane, such as like traveling, you know, like driving or flying on a plane or whatever, right? Whatever they're doing in the current time is not really worth reading, right? And then the author sends us back in time and we have a flashback. That is going to be like the best case scenario for me when it comes to flashbacks that are mid-chapter, because we were already doing something kind of boring anyways. Why not have some backstory? Go for it, I guess. Just about any other flashback is now going to be interrupting the story, and I hate it. I hate it. There's nothing that makes me like grimace harder when I'm reading, where it's like Bill looked at Gwen and remembered her quinceañera 10 years ago. And like I imagine like that Wayne's World where like it's an instant grunt from me, dog. I will say that I do like start of chapters a little bit better than mid-chapter sequences, mainly just because they happen at the beginning of a chapter. I'm not reading in the current timeline and like getting attached to whatever's happening and then thrown back. It's like a mini prologue or something, if you will. The problem with it is that it needs to be established that we've gone back in time. So they almost always start off with some sort of line that's like 10 years earlier, or on my 17th birthday, or the day my dad died. Something that lets us know that we're in the past. The thing that gets me to hate it more than a mid-chapter flashback is that I don't know how long this is going to last. The shorter the better, as long as we get it done before the chapter's over. Unlike the then and now, where we flip back and forth, the unexpected, just whole brick of a chapter being a flashback, being a, you know, a time warp. Ugh. Just like with the beginning of a chapter flashbacks, these also have to start off with some sort of like 10 years earlier or something else, whatever it is that makes us know that we are now going back in time. But these chapters go the full distance, and sometimes they might even go multiple chapters, and I don't know when I'm getting out of it, right? At the end of the first chapter that is a flashback, I am not guaranteed, because there's been no, you know, this is a random chapter. I have not been put into a rhythm, so I have no guarantee that the next chapter is going to be back in current time in the storyline that I actually was growing to care for, right? I have no idea. So now I'm, you know, kind of nervous about like, well, how long am I gonna be stuck here? You know, if it's only one chapter and I flip that page and then it's like, you know, I recognize that I'm back in the current timeline, great. That's much better than multiple chapters, but still, like, there's a little, like, I honestly have like anxiety when I get into a flashback chapter and I have no clue when it's ending and if the next chapter is going to be a flashback chapter as well. Further on that is that these chapters make me distrust the author, because if we've never had a flashback before, we've never, you know, we didn't fall into that rhythm, and chapter 14 happens to be a flashback chapter, I now never know when I'm going to go to the next chapter and I'm going to be in a flashback again. I don't know when it's coming. And again, I have a little anxiety that I'm going to be taken away from this good story that I want to read, and I'm going to be sent back in time to learn some more backstory stuff. Now, I have read some exceptions to these rules. There's always exceptions to the rules. One of my critique partners even was doing flashbacks, and the way that they did it, it was not making me dread whether or not we're going to have a flashback coming up soon. They were able to smooth out their transitions very well. They made it to where those flashbacks were very impactful. They basically made it kind of like worth the reader's while. And that's the main takeaway for my tip on how to make flashbacks work, is any amount of information that you can give the reader in the now timeline, do that. Sprinkle your backstory out throughout the timeline. Get it in there. That way is 100% better. However, if you have to do a flashback, then make sure that those flashbacks are super impactful. They're enticing in a way to where the reader is saying, okay, we're going to get more of a flashback. This should be good. A lot of movies books and TV shows have done this very well, where you know as a reader or a viewer that the clues to the mystery are in the past. You know that the information is back in the past, but you know, you're watching the main characters struggle through the current time. When you have to go back into the past, you're like kind of geared up for it, right? You're like, okay, here we go. We're gonna get some more information. We're gonna get some clues. This should be interesting. This should be entertaining, and it's gonna make it to where when I come back to the current time, I'm gonna have more information to work with to figure out what this mystery or whatever the action is that's going on, whatever that conflict is. That is how you make flashbacks their absolute best, is when you make them enticing and you make them very impactful to your story. Let me know down in the comments below how you handle flashbacks. Do you like flashbacks? Because again, I hate them. Make sure to subscribe down below for more videos, and until the next one, happy writing, happy reading.